Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thank you for joining us for this IPA talk. And with me today, I'm very fortunate to have here is Dr. Seth Chapman. Seth is the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services, CFO at St. Charles School District number 303. Seth, thanks for being with me.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate that. So, Seth, just to kind of give a little bit of the story of what's got you sitting here today is I was reading one of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials' recent journals, and there was an article in there that was very timely, for some tough reasons, obviously, in terms of its timeliness. But the title was, Can School Shootings Be Prevented? And it had to do with some research that you had done as part of your doc program and finishing that up. But you have done some pretty significant research around this topic of school shootings, and I felt like, obviously, as we're dealing, with the recent events in Parkland, Santa Fe, and some other places, thought it would be good to have you come in, talk with us a little bit about that, and just share what you found, because I think some of your findings could be very informative for schools as we continue to work to keep our schools safe and all of that stuff. So again, appreciate that. And so let's just get started talking with us about why you chose this topic. When you think about dissertation topics, this may not be the first thing people gravitate towards, because
Right.
it's a tough issue. And obviously with a dissertation, it's something you're going to spend a lot of time with and dig in deep. So what got you to this point?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was actually starting a topic on social media for my dissertation topic back in 2012. And as you're aware, and most of us are aware, unfortunately, Sandy Hook took place that December. And when that happened, it just gave me a different frame of reference for some of the issues that we're facing today in society. And I thankfully have a great dissertation committee who is willing to be flexible with me and to allow me to do something that I would call fairly non-traditional. So I dug in to do some research on that and looked for a framework or model to attach that to, and it all worked out. So to your point, I wish we weren't talking about this today. I wish it was a topic that wasn't quite as relevant, but it is. And so hopefully something can be learned from it.
Sure. So let's just get right to it, Seth. What did you find with your research? What was really most compelling from what you were looking at?
There's so many different things that I thought were compelling. The most surprising thing to me is, I think when you think back in time about school shootings, people think of Columbine and think that's where it started. And the research that I went through and the framework that we have is from Catherine Newman and her colleagues in a book called Social Roots of School Shootings. And in her study, she kind of documented some of those cases, and really 1996 seemed to be where that tipping point occurred. And there were actually 7 incidents before Columbine that took place. And they weren't as large scale, and they weren't maybe as high profile in the media. But that was very surprising to me to learn that. And then secondly, to just move past that concept of profiling. That was really where profiling started, was in the middle to late 90s. And to then look at it as a more complex issue than simply just saying that individual looks like they might be a school shooter.
So talk to us. You mentioned this framework that you worked around. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so Newman and her colleagues went through a process of looking for what were the factors that really kind of held water in terms of the cases that they went through, and they found 5 necessary but not sufficient. That was her term, necessary but not sufficient indicators of a school shooter, and she tested some of those theories. Those individual areas are marginalization, which is a term I care for a little bit better than bullying. I think bullying gets used a little bit too much. Yeah. So marginalization, failure of surveillance systems, and that's not surveillance from a technical perspective, but what are our staff, what's their ability to witness and to see a problem as it's occurring. Psychological issues, which really expands a little bit more beyond psychological. It also gets into social disorders and things of that nature. The next one would be cultural scripts, a template for potentially how a problem in a student or an adolescent's life could be resolved through violence. And then lastly, and of course the most important part, is access to a weapon or a gun. And so those are the 5 indicators that she explored, and then I essentially replicated and extended that beyond to see those applications as time went through.
So what did you see then in terms, did that framework seem to work through in terms of, what you were looking at?
Yeah, it did, and clearly access to guns was 100%, that they wouldn't have occurred, but in the lowest category of indicator, which was the cultural script, it was still 10 out of 12 clearly met it, and arguably 11 out of 12 met that. So very significant support for this framework, and as it lends itself to trying to assess risk in schools.
So, Seth, I appreciate you kind of working us through the framework a little bit. And obviously, when we think about research, we want to do what we can to start tying it back into, the now what. What can we be doing? What can we do to be as preventative as possible and keep these things from happening? Do the things that, really are within our locus of control. So, looking at this from a school leader's perspective, there are a few of those 5 that I think, school leaders can be engaged with. But the first one that obviously immediately comes to mind for me anyway is the marginalization. What do we need to be doing in schools to keep kids from getting marginalized and feeling like they're isolated from the school community, all of that. So as you were looking through the research and you were kind of wrestling with some of these issues, do you have any thoughts along those lines that might be helpful for school leaders to reflect on and consider back home? Yeah,
absolutely. And I will qualify this with saying I've never been a principal, nor am I a school psychologist. Tremendous amount of respect for the work that they do. But the research does really indicate an importance for connectedness. So for students to feel a sense of belonging in their schools, many principals, in my experience, are fantastic at that. That recognize that every student who walks through the door is important. Simple things such as just welcoming them when they come in, understanding what a good day and a bad day looks like for those students. If they're a student who may not have a traditional pathway of interest, finding an outlet for that interest. And, a lot of schools over the years, back when I was in school, there weren't hundreds of clubs. And now there's a lot more opportunities for kids to get plugged in. But sometimes, those students may not feel comfortable doing that. So I think that's a big piece of it. The students involved in this weren't that loner type per se, but they were on the social fringes, so they kind of flew under the radar in terms of where they belonged and where they fit. So I think it's important for principals and for other administrators to understand the fact that at the surface level, kids may seem okay, but if they're not plugged in somewhere, there's a good chance that they may not be.
Yeah. So with school safety, I'd say, Seth, there's a real community aspect of this too. I've been a former school leader and I've sat in on meetings with police and fire and engaged with them on different issues and then broader community groups as well. From what you learned through this process, what are some things that school leaders need to keep in mind when it comes to engaging community members and maybe even some of those first responders as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're fortunate in St. Charles. We have excellent resources, but I would argue probably just about anywhere in the state we have very dedicated police and fire who are more than happy and willing to get involved in the process. We've been through a great process. Our Assistant Superintendent for Operations, John Baird, has led a process in our district that brings in, we have 4 municipalities that we have to work with. So sometimes you get conflicting information from those people. Yeah. But, as he always...
Many school districts do work over multiple municipalities in that way. So I can understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so his line to me is if you offer a meal, they'll show up. Right. So we tend to do that. We offer a meal to the group. We bring them in and we talk about, hey, what do we need to be doing to foster a good working relationship? How do we prepare better for the what ifs if this situation arises? And that to some extent is a little more reactive, but we've got a perfect opportunity right now as we're doing construction and expanding our middle schools to talk about what does the facility need to look like. What does it look like if you're coming into this building, and how do you need to be able to operate? Where does command center go, and how are we reunifying our staff? And so when I look at that part of the community, I think that's very important. And then there's also the other side, which is community-based counseling, making sure that you have resources in place for students, because in schools oftentimes we're looked to be the expert in all these areas, right. But we just can't be the expert in all these areas, and certain things elevate higher than that. So who are you going to go to? Who are you going to bring in when those situations arise?
Absolutely. Well, thinking about the principalship, if that person is to be the CEO of their school, with the focus in on leadership and all of these, the complex web of things that they need to be responsible for, it's absolutely critical that they build those good relationships with every police chief that they would work with within their school district, those at the fire department, and then all the community groups that could be there. And I agree. Let's get together, let's have dinner, and then let's talk about this so that we're all on the same page, right? Absolutely. So let me ask you, Seth, do you, there in St. Charles, do you utilize any certain types of tools that helps with this, any types of technologies, anything like that is available? Or, you talked about the physical plant, particularly now that you're going through some construction. Anything there that you're trying to make sure that you're doing with regards to the facility, just so that it's secure?
I don't know so much on the technology side. We do work with police and fire to talk about some of our doors and cameras and entries, and we are working in conjunction with them to talk about access to cameras and things like that should an incident arise. So I think that would probably fit into that category. Right. But beyond that, not so much. I mean, it really is about trying to do some tabletops, some exercises with our staff, and getting them engaged in that process. And then we invite them in to do some of their active shooter drills. The police in particular oftentimes are looking for a place to do their training, and so we invite them into our schools to do that training, which is also helpful because they get to know our buildings really well.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, you talk about tabletops, but anything beyond that with regards to the training that you're doing with staff?
At this point, we're actually in process of talking about some more training. When we look at some of our staff that oftentimes get forgotten about it, our receptionists play a real important role.
Oh, sure.
If someone walks
first line of defense in many ways,
Yeah.
right? You talk about culture, the first person people talk to, they see. I mean, that's very impactful on a school community.
Absolutely. So we need them to be aware of what to do in certain situations, because not everybody's going to come in the door being pleasant, and not every time people are going to just accept what the receptionists say. So they need to understand the strategies to diffuse those situations. They need to understand when it's appropriate, and it's really not appropriate to be letting those parents or even spouses go back into the building. We saw an incident in California where a spouse came in and they thought it was okay, and it ended up in fatalities. So really just asking them to be really attentive to their responsibilities in keeping that building secure. But it's everybody, right? I mean, it's door propping that we've got to be aware of. It's the maintenance staff who really are there early in the morning, keeping their eyes and out. It's the bus drivers who overhear conversations. So all those things I think should be part of a regular training with our staff. Yeah.
So let me ask you, Seth, having you kind of dig back to your dissertation. And if you're anything like me, you kind of like to get away from it for a while after spending so much time, but obviously this is a real critical issue for us in this moment in time. As you look at this research moving forward, if somebody were to take an interest in this topic and want to go further, where are some areas that people might want to take an interest in based on your experience, with this topic?
Yeah. My study, or the study that Dr. Summers and I worked on together, it was a study that was directly related to the worst of the worst, very severe, multiple fatalities, K-12 schools, that there was actually a recent event, right? So a student who have graduated 3 or 4 years wouldn't qualify because we wouldn't be able to see the surveillance piece of that. What I look at moving forward, and we've seen several of these, in particular here in Illinois, a couple within the last year, are these averted instances.
So what does that mean?
So when I say averted, I mean an attempt at a school shooting, which may or may not have been a rampage school shooting, but certainly we know of Mattoon last year, and we know of Dixon just recently, are two instances that thankfully, due to very responsible and brave individuals, averted the situation. But what was happening behind the scenes there? Because that kind of dies down. We don't get as much facts about those cases. So if somebody was going to dig into something further in terms of research, that would be a very rich area that could provide some interesting information.
Yeah. Do you think it would be appropriate for someone to utilize the similar framework in terms of, what might have been some causation for that possibly, or correlation rather, in this situation?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think this framework could still very much apply. Before going into this framework, I actually looked at another one back from 2000 by Marianne O'Toole, which is a great framework, but there's a lot there, and it's really hard to parse it down. And the framework by Newman really keeps those into some discrete buckets that I think are easier to analyze and to test. And so yeah, absolutely, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. If you were to give school leaders, one thing that if they only had time to deal with one thing right now, if school were to start tomorrow, what would you recommend that would be so that they can be in the process to make sure that we don't have another school shooting, or at least in their school?
One that's a little bit more pragmatic, I think, and something that principals, when hopefully they're getting some vacation time and some breaks in here, because I know they very much need it. But as they come back into July, I think transitions are an area that are really important. Half of the studies so 6 of the 12 were instances in which students were at that school within the last year. It was their first year at the school.
So either they had moved in, or they had maybe come from a lower grade into a new building, like
exactly.
From 8th to high school, something
Correct.
like that. Oh, very interesting.
Correct. So transitions, and part of the article refers to this. There's research done, and this is certainly outside of my expertise, but I cited a couple references that relate to the fact that we know that transitions are an anxious period of time for students. Yeah. I would encourage principals to really get to know those students who are coming in that you don't know, from another grade, maybe they're coming from parochial school, as you indicated, maybe they're moving in from out of town. What do we know about those students? Is it possible, if you have got the time, to make a phone call out to the principal at the prior school and get a better understanding? That could be a huge area, and of course you never really know what that call can actually mean in terms of what it prevented, because it may not occur. But I think that there's a lot to be learned there. Secondly, and this is on a larger scale level, and this is really going to be a district decision, is what they want to do in terms of embracing behavioral threat assessment in general. And in part of the article, it talks about Deisinger and Randazzo's threat assessment process. And I would encourage schools to really start that process. And it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be perfect. And I think we as administrators struggle because we want it to be perfect and to have all the answers before we start. I don't see that ever really happening with behavioral threat assessment. So I would encourage administrators and principals to be at the forefront of pushing to, if you don't already have a threat assessment team, to get one. And if you do, to ensure that process is consistent, that the proper documentation is being made on these cases, that they're being followed up with. Students that are being maybe privately placed, even out of state, don't forget that they usually return to your community. Right. So we can't just assume, and we talked earlier today about Senate Bill 100, and those are not problems that are gone, and they stay in your community, and so follow up on those cases.
Yeah, I think we learned that the hard way here with recent events here over the last several months, for sure. Absolutely. Well, and this is maybe going to be a bit of a shameless plug, but IPA here recently has, to your point, started doing training around threat assessment. We work with Dr. Scott Bloomquist, who's a assistant regional superintendent, and one of his colleagues, in bringing that and finding very quickly that because of the popularity of those, schools are finding that that's probably something that they need to look at. And what I appreciate about the process they're looking at is not only is it looking to assess the viability of the threat, but also what types of resources then do they need to put into play to support these young people that are dealing with tough situations, because they're young, they need help. And this is an outcry. Obviously, it's a poor choice for one, but we definitely need to provide them the support so that hopefully things can get better for them for their lifetime, you know. So, Seth, as we wrap up here, any resources that you might recommend people could, if they're looking to learn more about this? Obviously, we've got a copy of your blog on our website, and we'll be sure that we give people quick access to that. But any place else that people might want to go to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been working fairly closely with Eric Arnold at Western Illinois University with the Illinois School and Campus Safety. You know, they offer free training for behavioral threat assessment. I know the one that just sold out there in July. There's a couple of them that have sold out, but they're going to be offering more. Those are excellent resources. I would also do a plug for ISB's website. There's a safety section on the ISB site with a lot of great information out there as well. So those are two fantastic areas that people can go to find more information. And then I'm certainly happy to help people directly. They're certainly happy to welcome to email me directly at seth.chapman@d-as-in-David303.org.
Wonderful. Appreciate that. And hopefully you get some people seeking you out for some help. So Dr. Seth Chapman here with me talking about school shooting and a really important critical issue at this moment in time. Again, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thanks for joining us for this IPA talk, and all the links for all of this information and IPA in general you can find in the description of this video. Anytime you need help from the IPA, you can always get us on the web at ilprincipals.org. Take care.